Hello everyone, I'm Bobtheorc, and today we're going to talk about Ukraine. Now, I haven't spoken about Ukraine in a while. I've been pretty busy with things, but mostly it's because Ukraine hasn't been particularly interesting. It's been largely a static situation with either side making small gains. But recently there have been a couple of big changes, and I would, at this point, describe Ukraine as having transitioned from an early game to a mid-game situation. If we looked at it from a strategic gaming type point of view, there were the opening moves originally where Russia made its Kiev gambit, and that didn't seem to work out. I think they were hoping to get an early win, and Ukraine performed very well early on. And then things kind of settled down into a static, grinding war of attrition. There were a couple of assumptions I made that have proven to be incorrect, and I'll talk to you briefly about that. The first assumption was, if you look at my earlier videos, I thought that this would eventually end up as a negotiated solution, and I no longer think that. I never expected NATO to essentially go out of their way to sabotage any peace negotiations with Russia. I know that NATO wants to use this as a means to grind down the Russian military. They're hoping to turn this into another 1980-style Afghanistan, and I don't think that's going to be the case. But, early on, when it looked like there were some potential peace options in Istanbul, allegedly Boris Johnson, presumably with the backing of NATO, promised unlimited NATO support for Ukraine if Zelensky backed out of the peace negotiations. I'm sure that's an oversimplified view of what happened, but I never thought that this would go to a full I never thought it would escalate quite the way it's going to escalate. I always thought that there would be some sort of negotiated settlement. Now, that's not to say that there isn't time still for negotiation, but I find that more and more unlikely to happen. Now, the second assumption I made was early on, I assumed that Putin was on the clock, that he had a limited amount of time to wrap this thing up, and that has proven to be not the case. If we look at the economic situation, it was always the United States strategy of the Biden administration to try and economically destroy Russia. Now, while I never thought that they could sanction Russia to death, I'd early on warned that certain actions like taking Russia off the SWIFT system and other sanctions would backfire on us. I did not fully appreciate the industrial capacity of Russia, and if you look at some of the reports, Russia's able to provide a lot more ammunition for their artillery than we can provide to Ukraine. At this point, my understanding from talking to my Ukrainian friends is that the Ukrainian economy is largely destroyed. And from talking to my Russian friends, the Russian economy, while hurting, seems to be doing largely okay. And it would seem that now time is in Russia's favor, especially as we approach a winter that Europe is probably not fully prepared to deal with. I think it was naive to assume that the sanctions would crush Russia so quickly. But I think but that's another topic. I think that just gets into the West's fundamental misunderstanding of how Eastern Europe and Russia works. Another assumption that I could not have predicted was I never for the life of me thought that Ukraine would so mindlessly throw away their troops. Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan has all these mountains and it's easy to ambush. And early on in the Kiev region, north of Kiev, there were some ambush opportunities, and the Ukrainian forces seem to be good at ambushing Russians in the forest. However, Ukraine has turned into a game of see who's stupid enough to go out into the open field so the other side can blast them with artillery. And for the most part, Russia learned that lesson very quickly, and Ukraine appears to have not learned that lesson. I'm fully convinced at this point that NATO is hoping to, or is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, hoping to inflict whatever damage they can on Russia. And while Ukraine is claiming that they've killed a lot of Russians, the reality is most of the people they've killed were the Donbass militia people. And my suspicion, based on what I've heard from my Ukrainian friends, is that the majority of the supplies are not reaching the front lines, and that they're basically losing, that their troops are getting thrown away. And I have no reason to doubt that. I think the Ukrainians are very brave people, and I think they're willing to fight. But I think that they're, based on conversations with my friends, I think that they're becoming skeptical of the military strategy that they're conducting the war in. And I think that morale is probably a limited resource at this point. And it's hard to estimate how many Ukrainians have died. I would imagine several tens of thousands at this point, maybe more. And it's important to consider that at the beginning of the war, Ukraine had a mobilized force of somewhere around 750,000 troops. And the Russians only went in with like 150 to 200,000 troops, depending on how large the Donbass militia was and what you count. But the Ukrainian army outnumbered the Russians easily 2-1 at the beginning of the war. Now, one of the things that's changed is that Ukraine has launched a broad series of counterattacks against the Russians. And we have to understand that the Ukrainians and the Russians are playing two completely different games. The Ukrainian team is playing for territory. They want to reclaim their territory. The Russian team is playing for the destruction of the Ukrainian military. Russia, if we look at it historically, they've historically not cared as much about territory, and they've always prioritized the destruction of the enemy army. And that seems to be what's happening here. The Russians have stated that's the case, and I have no reason to doubt that, because that appears to be what they're doing. One of the things I'm going to bring up is there are two strategically important spots in Ukraine in the fight. You have down here in the Kherson region, and you have the Dnipropetrovsk area. Now, Kherson in the south, that's going to be key to a Russian breakthrough into the broader Ukraine. Recently we saw the Russians pull back from Kharkiv. The Ukrainians took advantage of that to attack the Kharkiv area, gaining a lot of territory, but inflicting relatively few casualties on the Russian side and suffering quite a few casualties on their side. I think it was a Pyrrhic victory. I think that it was probably a waste of resources, and it brought the Ukrainians out into the open field where the Russians can shell them. I'm not going to go so far as to say it was a Russian setup. I think the Russians have correctly identified that their priorities right now are in the Kherson region, and I'll show you why in a minute. But remember, the Ukrainians and the Russians are playing for two different games. The Zelensky regime needs to show battlefield successes so that they can continue gaining aid from NATO and their Western friends. Whereas the Russians are self-sufficient when it comes to their military. One of the reasons they deployed such a limited force, I think, is because they deployed what they could logistically support. And if you're not focused on gaining territory, you can sit in well-defended positions and shell whoever's dumb enough to go out into the open. And that seems to be what the Russians have largely done. They've taken a very aggressive position, and then they've defended it. And most people familiar with military history, military doctrine will know that it's easier to defend than it is to attack. I think the rule of thumb is you want about 3-1 advantage to attack, and defending can be relatively easy with smaller forces as long as you're well supplied to have a lot of firepower. Now, in the early game, the Russian goal was clearly to take Mariupol and connect the land bridge from between Russia and Crimea, and they've been successful in that. And the mid-game will be a little bit different. I think the strategy of the mid-game is going to be, from the Russian perspective, they're going to try and grind down the Ukrainian forces. They've recently mobilized 300,000 of their reservists, which, is disturbing some of my friends in Russia. There's a little bit of a panic going on, but not much. I think that the younger people are concerned that they're going to get drafted. But one thing to consider is that Russia has a pool of reserve soldiers of about 25 million people. And these are all people who have previously served in the military. One of the things that a lot of Eastern European countries do, and Middle Eastern countries as well, that's alien to us here in the West, is they have a compulsory military service for men, where all men have to serve in the military for, a year or 2 years, some limited amount of time, just to have basic training. And this way, if there's ever a large-scale war, they can be brought up on relatively short notice with only a few months of training in a reserve force. Even some of my female friends in Russia have told me that when they were in high school, they had to learn how to take apart, put back together, and fire an AK-47. And my Ukrainian friends probably had somewhat similar experiences. I know that a lot of the Ukrainian civilians are being formed into local civil defense units to provide logistical and back-end support to take the pressure off the frontline soldiers. And I think that the Russian mobilization, and this is going to be a limited mobilization as they put it, and I think they're telling the truth on that, that's going to be to take pressure off of their frontline guys. My understanding is that the Russian limited mobilization is only looking for mobilizing people with prior combat experience, so none of my friends should be affected. And these are going to probably be, older, retired soldiers who can keep their cool and protect rearguard areas to free up the frontline soldiers. As the fighting expands beyond the Donbass region, you're going to find, I think, that the Donbass militias are going to focus on defending their own territory, and as the Russians advance throughout Ukraine, they're going to be having to use their professional army and mercenaries, and the Donbass militia will largely stay in the Donbass region. That is my anticipation. So I'm going to describe what I think the Russians are likely to do, and I'll describe what I think the Ukrainians could do. And now keep in mind, I have no military experience. I'm a gamer. I've played strategy games and military strategy games all my life. I've studied military history for most of my life, and I'm going to be looking at this from a gaming perspective of, if Ukraine were a strategy game and you wanted to win the game with maximum points and minimum losses, how would you do it? And that's the perspective I'm operating under. I don't think that it'll exactly go this way. I think that Ukraine will likely continue to throw away their troops, because I think the NATO advisors who are assisting them are more concerned with killing Russians than preserving the Ukrainian youth, and I think that's a terrible thing. I think that, especially in times of war, preserving your people is your top priority, and I think that in the future, Ukraine will probably grow to despise, or at least distrust, the NATO advisors who so casually encourage them to throw themselves away. Or maybe it's the Ukrainian military officers who are doing it, but I can't, I can't imagine that, because usually military officers are more conservative with their troops. But I don't know the inner politics of Ukraine, and I don't know the inner politics of Russia. So like I said, I can only look at this from an outside perspective. So here's how I think the mid-game is going to play out. Like I said, the Kherson region is the most important part of the map. And it's going to be a Russian priority to isolate and take Odessa. I think a direct assault on Odessa is unlikely because it's an important historical Russian city, and they're not going to want to damage it too much. And if we look at the way that the Russians have been fighting this war, with the exception of Mariupol, which was sort of an all-or-nothing thing, all the roads passed through Mariupol, and they didn't really have a choice, and the Azovs were there, whom the Russians really despise. So they fought very hard in that area, but for the most part, the Russians have been avoiding fighting in the city. They've been playing a game of luring the Ukrainians out into the open field so they could artillery them, because Russian artillery is very good at blowing things up, and especially if it's in an open field where there's not a lot of cover. The general Russian artillery strategy, I believe, has been it's a lot more cost effective to blow up large areas with slightly less accurate artillery than to spend all the money on the smart munitions that America does, which is very costly. And this allows Russia to provide or to produce huge quantities of ammunition for their artillery. So here's what I think is going to happen. I think the first Russian move is going to be they're going to try and break out of the Kherson region and try and connect up with their people in Transnistria, which is the eastern part of Moldova. And this would effectively cut off Odessa from the north. Now, if the Ukrainians are smart, they're going to counter that and defend this area, but it's hard to say. I think that a large number of the Ukrainian defenses are in the Kherson region. They're certainly trying to defend Mykolaiv, because that's there's a lot of roads that go through there, and there's a series of rivers that are problematic if you can hold these rivers. That being said, a lot of the Ukrainian forces are tied up in the Donbass area and in the Kharkiv area. And I still think that Ukraine probably has more forces than the Russians do. And it's going to take probably a number of months to train and equip and mobilize the 300,000 reservists that Russia's activated. So we may not see this breakout until the wintertime or after the winter, before the spring thaw. I think that you're going to mostly see a grinding down of the Ukrainian forces, at least in the areas where they're out in the open. But I think this is going to be the primary objective. I also think there is an option that Russia may try and cut off Odessa from the west, either through an amphibious assault or going south from Transnistria. Romania is a possible avenue of supply for Odessa. I don't know if NATO would attempt that or not. I don't know if Romania would let them or not. And the terrain is not as favorable as bringing supplies in from Poland through Lviv. But so you may see the Russians attempt to cut this off, and you may not. Now, I am very confident that this will eventually happen. I couldn't tell you exactly when. The Russians are not going to operate under a specific timetable. I think their priority is to grind down the Ukrainian soldiers, and then once the Ukrainian army is weak enough, I think they would then try to make a breakout. The Russians are playing this very conservative. They're going very slow, and they're trying to preserve their forces. Because remember, Putin still has to answer to his people, and if a bunch of dead bodies come home, Russian people aren't going to be so happy, and that could affect him. So I think the Russian military is going to play this conservative, but there will eventually be a breakout. Now, the next thing they're likely to do is they're going to try and cut off the NATO supplies. They're going to have to break north and cut off Dnipropetrovsk, which is a major logistical center for the Ukrainians. Most of the supplies that enter into that go to the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass and Kharkiv regions are probably passing through Dnipropetrovsk. And then they're also going to have to cut off and isolate Kiev from Lviv. The Polish supplies, or the NATO supplies coming through Poland, enter into Lviv, which is a major logistical center in the west. And then they pass on towards Kiev and towards Dnipropetrovsk, and then into the areas of the fighting. And if Russia wants to end this, and I think that at this point, barring some sort of surprise negotiations, I think that Russia's going to try and grab the majority of Ukraine and force an unconditional surrender. That's my instinct at this point. I don't see why they wouldn't, because ostensibly they're destroying the Ukrainian army at a faster rate than they're taking casualties. And I think that with the winter coming, Europe's going to have a lot of problems, and the American economy is not doing very well either. And, the sanctions have clearly backfired on the West. And I think that the Russian economy is getting stronger. If you look at the value of the ruble compared to the dollar, the Russian ruble is trading stronger than before the war. And we'll see what happens. But I think that you're eventually going to see something, a cutting off of eastern Ukraine from Western supplies. That would be the logical thing. Now, what can the Ukrainians do? Now, the Ukrainian plan is likely going to be they're going to have to shore up their defenses. If they're smart, they're going to shore up their defenses in the Kherson region, and they're going to make sure they don't lose Dnipropetrovsk. There's a bunch of rivers that Ukraine can take advantage. The Ukrainian army can take advantage of. There's some forests. Ukraine is largely flat. There's not really a bunch of mountains or rough terrain. It's largely flat. And because of the potential mud, it's favorable for infantry on the defense if they're in strengthened positions. If they move out into the open, they're going to get screwed. If things go badly for them, especially in the east, you could see Ukraine taking advantage of the series of rivers and forests in the east to form a series of strong points to try and hold them off. I don't think the Russians are going to push hard in the east. I think they're going to come up from the south, take Odessa and go north. But, there isn't, if things go badly in the Donbass region for them, you could see them trying to fall back into a series of defensive lines. Now, Ukraine has been taking kind of a don't give up any inch of territory kind of thing. Like I said, Ukraine's playing for territory, whereas Russia's trying to destroy the Ukrainian army. I think that, that's a mistaken strategy on Ukraine's part. And if they're smart and if they start losing, territory, there are a series of fallback positions they could take. And maybe they'll start preparing them now with some of their civil defense forces. In the West, you could see Ukraine do something similar with the rivers and defensive positions there. If they lose Dnipropetrovsk, there's no point, and they lose Odessa, there's no point in holding the south. They might as well take up defensive positions behind the rivers to make the Russians advance more slowly, and give them a lot of logistical trouble. You could see small guerrilla-type operations using various man-portable missile weapons to destroy light vehicles. That's an option. I don't know how many of those Ukraine has left, and I don't know how many more NATO's going to supply, because the economy of the Western countries is starting to suffer, and we've already given Ukraine, my understanding is we've already given Ukraine the majority of our reserves and any new stuff we have to produce. On a final note, if things go badly for Ukraine, like really, really badly, it's possible that Poland may invade Ukraine and take back traditional Polish territory. I think if this is the case, you would see something like Poland declaring war on Ukraine, Ukraine immediately surrendering, Poland absorbing the territory, and then this territory being part of Poland would now be part of a NATO country, making it difficult for Russia to attack. Much like how Russia did the various referendums in the territories that they control to make those Russian territory, making it difficult for NATO to supply weapons to attack those territories. So we could see Ukraine split up between Russia and Poland, and this would not surprise me. I don't want to speculate on the likelihood of this happening, but this would not surprise me as a final stage if Ukraine can't bring Russia back to the negotiating table. I don't know if Russia will negotiate with Zelensky at this point. I think that it's more likely to bring Russia to the negotiating table if they inflict casualties rather than taking territory while suffering great losses. The best option for Ukraine, I think, is still a negotiated settlement, but I don't know if there's the political will to do that. And so that's kind of where my mind is at this time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. You can also check out my website, Bobtheorc.com, where you can download a free copy of my dad's book and some other things. Have a nice day. Goodbye.